Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. This is the Inept General bringing you another Total War Warhammer Legendary Lord lore video, and today we are going to be looking at Drycha, the Briarmaven of Woe. Now, this video is going to be a little bit different today, guys. We're going to go over the lore of Drycha, but in order to understand Drycha, we have to understand her perspective. So we're going to go through what makes her, like why she is the way she is. And in that light, we're going to go through some of the events of the Warhammer world from the perspective of either Drycha or somebody who follows Drycha, and the way in which they see the events that transpired in the past. So keep that in mind as we go through the story of the Briarmaven. To really understand Drycha, we have to go back to a time before the elves polluted her sacred wood, at a time even before the Great Cataclysm. It all began with a seduction. The great forest was vast, and the Oak of Ages roots had reached all parts of the Warhammer world. And it was through these world roots that the forest spirits discovered the island of the elves, Ulthuan, and on Ulthuan, another beautiful forest, the Forest of Avalorn. At first, these elves seemed innocent, and they marveled at the nature of our ancient forest spirits, as well they should. But these were things of blood and should not have been trusted. Many of the ancient forest spirits were taken in by the elves and shared their magical secrets, none more so than the misguided Durfu, one of the most ancient spirits in the Great Forest. He taught them many of our secrets, including how to shape their trees without cutting or sawing. He told them of the world roots and many of the forest spirits' other secrets. The elves used this sacred knowledge to make their lives easier and improve their natural forest. Some of the misguided forest spirits even thought this Avalorn forest had the potential to be awakened. Although they tried for many long years to replicate their own awakening, none of the trees of Avalorn ever awoke. In these heady times, the one weakness of the forest spirits was that we were too generous with our time for these creatures of blood. Then, the demons came. The polar gates were blasted asunder as chaos erupted into the Warhammer world. Creatures of fire and smoke crawled over the earth like a vast swarm of insects. Swathes of the great forest were burned in a matter of days. The forest spirits were locked into combat, fighting for their very survival, but they were not at full strength. Many of their brethren were living on the island of Ulthuan, and being unable to come home in this time of anarchy and chaos, the forest spirits still in the great forest were left lacking their full force. Those that did stand to defend their homes came together and fought for their very survival. Day after day, battle after battle, the conflict lasted for centuries. The great forest burned as the forest spirits were pushed further and further back, until at last, led by Coedil and Adinhu, the line was held. The great forest had become a mere fraction of its former self, but in this place, we could hold the demons at bay. For decades, the forest spirits held the line, with the remainder of the great forest nestled between two vast mountain ranges. And it was now, in this time, that Durfu the Absent returned to the great forest. The ranks of forest spirits had been decimated since his departure to Avalorn, oh so many years ago. And now, from where there were once hundreds of ancient tree men spirits, only 3 remain. Adinhu, the oldest and wisest of them all, with the gift of prophecy. Coedil the Cunning, who had been mainly leading the forces against the demons of chaos in the great forest. And Durfu, the Absent One, the Misguided, had returned. And not only had Durfu returned, having missed centuries of fighting, he returned having desecrated the world roots by transporting 2 elven babes with him. They were the children of the royal family of the elves, and it was debated what to do with these 2 creatures. At first, Adinhu was reluctant to accept the creatures into the wood. Coedil agreed with him, But Durfu, explaining what he saw in the elves and why he felt they could have had a very good relationship with the elves going forward, managed to convince Adinhu the Wise, who caved, thinking that slaughtering these two children would further alter the nature of the forest, which had already grown wild and violent, at least as far as he was concerned. Eventually, Durfu and Adinhu agreed to keep the children elves, as long as they slumbered for the entirety of their stay in the Great Forest. Many forest spirits disagreed with this decision. To have these two creatures in the forest was sacrilege, and many disagreed with Adinhu's interpretation of the forest needing to soften, for in the view of many forest spirits, they had just grown more adept at being able to defend themselves. The conflict had made them stronger. Eventually, a combination of the magics of the elves and the lizard men would drive excess chaos energy from the world and cause the demons to fade into nothingness. Then came the task of rebuilding. The Great Forest had been reduced in size, much like how we know it in the Warhammer world today. It is during this era, between negative 4,420 of the Imperial calendar, so some 6,000 odd years before the start of the Total War Warhammer timeline, and negative 1,500 of the Imperial calendar, that we know Drycha definitely existed. Whether she existed before and took part in the events of the Great Chaos Invasion, we're not sure. Records either don't exist and memories have faded, or she wasn't around then and sort of emerged in this era. But we know that Drycha was a branch wraith who had a number of her kin as her subjects. She's known to have held court among the roots of the great tree Adavok. She's said to have had the body of a goddess. Her naked flesh was silvery green, and thick hair of tangled roots and dead leaves coiled down her back, writhing like a nest of vipers. Her slender arms became elongated branches at the elbows, and her hands were blade-like talons, each the length of a short sword. When she turned her aspect to her more warlike nature, her face became twisted into that of a murderous hag. Her features became cracked, wooden, and sharp, matching the anger in her soul. These were halcyon days in the Great Forest. The mortals had been decimated by the Chaos Invasion, and so the forest spirits were free to tend to the needs of the forest, under virtually no threat. And when a minor or small threat did emerge of anyone looking to pillage the wood for its resources, the war with chaos had taught the forest spirits many ways to deal with such intruders. But all good things must come to an end. Eventually, the mortals recovered, and as their numbers grew, so did their territory, until the elves again came in contact with the Great Forest. The stories of tree spirits in Avalon had long since faded from memory into the realms of myth, and the elves who found themselves on the forest edge were fascinated by the forest spirits within. The forest spirits, including Drycha, shunned contact with these newly arrived elves. Whenever one of them would wander into the wood, the trees would move and bend, simply guiding them back out again. It wasn't perhaps as vicious a response as some demanded, but it was a peaceable enough one for now. When confronted with this reality that they could never really enter the wood, the elves resorted to a sickening tactic. They used waystones to entrap all the forest spirits within. No longer could they move around the world's surface as freely as they once did, with the magic of the waystones blocking their path. Eventually, as seems inevitable with these flesh bags, a great war befell the elves. Fighting the dwarves of the mountains, the two sides clashed for centuries. Eventually, facing a threat at home, the elves withdrew, all save for the elves who had made their home outside the Great Forest, the forest they now called Athaloran. These elves refused to leave when called home, drawn or tied by either fate or avarice to the Great Forest. They chose to remain behind. Now, with the territory around the Great Forest abandoned by the majority of the elves, the dwarves moved in to pillage its resources, to use the wood to fire its furnaces. They descended upon the Great Forest in huge numbers and began to chop it down. It was on the verge of winter, and many of the tree spirits had already entered their slumber for the season. The only ancient one of the treemen to still be awake was that misguided Durfu. And in his madness and desperation, he made a decision that would forever change the fate of the great forest. Knowing that with the forces he had available, he would not be able to fight off the dwarves, he guided the dwarves through the forest, straight on to the settlement of elves. The elves themselves fought valiantly and managed to defeat the smaller dwarven contingent, but now they feared for their lives, for they knew there would be dwarven retaliation. At this point, Durfu reached out and allowed them to seek shelter within the great forest. The tree spirits were still very cautious of the elves at this time. They'd been done a service, fair, and they were sheltering the elves from their enemies in recompense. But they did not seek out contact, the elves, and indeed avoided them. It wasn't until the dwarves eventually retaliated and gathered a force 10,000 strong to march into the woods to seek out these elves that the tree spirits eventually revealed themselves, Adinhu being the first, and thus started the first great council. This is when the corruption of blooded creatures firmly established itself in the heart of the forest. In that great council, Adinhu the Wise pledged the lives of the tree spirits to fight alongside the elves against these dwarven invaders, sealing the fate of hundreds of tree spirit kin who would fade into oblivion that day. As the fighting started, two notable characters from the elves were missing. Their mightiest warrior and their strongest mage had disappeared during the Great Council, only to re-emerge during the battle as avatars for their elven gods, going by the names of Orion and Ariel. And together they vanquished the dwarves. But no sooner had the dwarves been defeated than a huge horde of greenskins began marching into the forest. Presumably challenged by either the elves or the dwarves themselves, they felt like getting into a good fracas, and the tree spirits and the elves were all that stood in their way. The combined army was fought to its last legs until the emergence of Orion on the battlefield, who helped turn the tide. The day was victorious, but many tree spirits had been lost during this fight, and in the opinion of some, like Drycha, not allowing the blooded creatures just to fight amongst themselves and then clean up the mess, and the victory had not been worth the sacrifice of so many of her kin. It's not explicitly stated whether Drycha fought in this battle alongside the elves, but it is known that it's from this battle where she got the first names in the mantra she sings constantly, even to this day, of the names of the fallen treekin who have died in service of these fleshy elves. And so against Drycha's wishes, the elves had earned themselves a place in Athelloren. The elves and tree spirits now lived side by side within the great forest, but things would only get worse from here. Around the year -1000 of the imperial calendar, Ariel, this newly anointed demigod of the elves, sensed a disturbance in the weave. She sent herself out in spirit form to investigate the source of this corruption, and in her travels, she discovered the Blight, Sinethir, as the elves would call him, or as his own people called him, Morgor, the Beastman, the source of corruption. She, in her disgust at what this thing was doing to the magical weave, decided to smite the creature, burning him to ash. But little did she know, Morgor is nigh on invincible and will always return. Having tasted a small measure of this elf witch's power, he hungered for more, and so set about making plans to trace her back to her homeland of Athelloren. And in her provocation of this undying creature, Ariel had doomed the lives of many of the tree spirits. This came to a crescendo in the year -800 of the imperial calendar, while over years the ranks of beastmen within the forest, who had always been a present threat in the wood, had grown to a size never before seen. Morgor, the corrupted, had made it to the great forest. Now, the disease he brought down upon the forest caused huge casualties. The dryads in particular of the tree spirits were susceptible and were known to turn on their elven comrades only to be chopped down by the elves. This blight brought about by this elven witch decimated the ranks of tree spirits and added names to Drycha's everlasting song of mourning. By this point, Drycha served at Coedil's side, for he was the only ancient tree man spirit she found sympathetic to her woes. Coedil, in his own right, was a towering creature 50 feet tall, an ancient and twisted oak. Running battles with the beastmen erupted all over Athel Loren, the two forces gathering their strength. Eventually, they faced off against each other in the glade of Adavok, Drycha's home and realm. The two sides clashed with a cacophony of braying screams and creaking oak. Fighting was fierce. Coedil, the massive ancient tree man, hero of the wars against chaos, smashed through the enemy lines, tendrils and claws tearing beastmen to shreds as he crushed others underneath his immense feet. Drycha fought by his side, hacking and slicing at the beastmen hordes, calling down her magic to reap her vengeance on them being present in her homeland. Coedil was fighting his way to the source of this evil. He was fighting his way to Morgor. Eventually, this hero of the Treekin pierced the corruptor and hoisted him up into the sky. There, Ariel, focusing all of her power, streamed flame at this mutinous horror as it screamed in Coedil's hand. Blood poured from the creature's wounds onto the soil below, and Coedil could feel its poison running over his hands. As Ariel's spell breached the creature's defenses and rendered it into a pile of ash, the beastman lost heart and broke. The day had been won, but the price had been heavy. The corruptor's blood was poison to any living thing, and where its blood and body had fallen, it would forever corrupt the tree that had been there, the tree that had once been Drycha's home. And for this day, until the end of days, would simply be known as the Tree of Woe. Her whole realm had been polluted by the corruptor's influence, and anything that would grow there from now on would grow wrong and twisted. Drycha had lost everything. Her home realm would never be the same again. Nothing healthy would ever grow. She would never share the company of many trees and tree spirits that were her friends. Her life had been forever shattered. Loss and rage overcame her. What had this witch queen brought down upon them? The line had been crossed. Enough was enough. Drycha bided her time, speaking to like-minded treekin who had seen the plight brought down upon the great forest by these elves. She enrolled the help of Coedil, the ancient tree lord master who had fought the corruptor himself, his bark blackened with the scars of battle. Time was on their side. And over the ensuing 500 or so years, as the Wood Elves continued to venture out to attract more enemies, costing the lives of more treekin, she added names to her mantra, her song of the dead, season after season. She and Coedil gathered their forces, and the day of reckoning would be coming. Some 500 years since the Battle of Anguish with Morgor, the time for vengeance had finally come. Coedil, Drycha, and their forces waited for Ariel to slumber for the winter, along with her lord Orion to pass, awaiting his rebirth in the spring. If they could stop these two, they could purge the elves from the great forest. Orion was the simpler one to deal with. If they could kill all the Wild Riders, none would be available to take his place come the spring, and so they would only have to deal with Ariel, and combined they felt they had the strength to do that, if she slumbered over the course of the winter. As Drycha and their army approached the king's glade, they set their sights on the Wild Riders, surrounding their position and launching into a fearsome slaughter. Dryads cut down elves and impaled them upon their blade-like limbs, while others were ripped apart by the towering monsters of the forest. The slender wild riders were pounded into the ground by heavy wooden arms and set upon by swarms of dark fairies, wings fluttering and knives glittering. Ancient Coedil sent elves flying with each sweep of his massive arms, and he dragged dozens more to their deaths, his clawing roots reaching up beneath them to ensnare and slice them open. But Drycha's plan went awry. She did not know that Ariel would be awakened simply by the act of elven blood falling on the forest soil. Ariel managed to muster her forces and fight back. They had underestimated her power, and Ariel had managed to shatter their forces, scattering Drycha and the handmaidens of Coedil, and ensnaring the ancient tree lord himself, imprisoning him in the wild wood. Many of Coedil's forces were also ensnared there and trapped by elven waystones in that area. It said that Ariel could not kill Coedil, for he was a part of the forest, as she believed herself to be, so it'd be like slicing off a piece of her own soul. But she was not of the woods, not like the tree spirits of old. In the years that followed, they called Coedil corrupted through his battle with Morgor, but it was not corruption. It was vengeance, pure and simple. These elves fractured our forces in the time of direst need during the Great Chaos Invasion. They then came to the remnants of our homeland and entrapped us in our own home, not allowing the great tree spirits to expand and grow the great forest to its former glory. They summoned down the creature Morgor upon the tree spirits, and provoked countless conflicts with dwarves, elves, orcs, and men as their king goes on rambunctious hunts, killing for the sheer sport of it. These creatures are the ones who have corrupted the wood, not the mighty hero Coedil, whose leadership has saved the forest on countless occasions. They called this event the Great Betrayal, but the Great Betrayal had come years earlier, where Durfu had allowed these elven usurpers into the sacred wood. Drycha figured out a way to speak to her master in his imprisonment, and would venture forth into the world to find a way to free Coedil, so they would eventually have the strength to rid their sacred land of the elven disease. And since then, there have been numerous sightings of Drycha around the Warhammer world. In the year 2026, around 500 years before the start of the Total War Warhammer timeline, it was said that there was a number of forest spirits gathering in southern Bretonnia, and they defeated the Duke of Carcassonne, storming La Cour d'Abbey and stealing a relic therein. She's also reported to have appeared in the Drakwold, where peasants tell of stories of trees coming to life, hungry for human blood. In the Ardennes forest, villagers only gather deadwood for tales of neighboring villages who felled trees lying in ruin, scraps of tattered meat, all that remains of the villagers therein. At a shrine of Tal in the Reichwald forest, the relic known as the Fang of Talroth was stolen. Following that, in Paravon, the final artifact is said to have been stolen, allowing Drycha to finally free Coedil and set back on their path of vengeance. And that brings us up to date on the tale of Drycha, the sources of her anger laid out, her all-consuming rage aimed firmly at the elves of Athelloren. In truth, her insatiable rage would probably not be sated by the death of all the elves of Athelloren, and would probably extend out into all the flesh of mortal beings, rendered fertile the ground upon which her forest could grow anew. Now, looking at some of her rules on the tabletop, she definitely had Law of Shadow, which we know we've seen in the game before. She provoked fear. She had hatred in the game. She also had a rule called Fanatical Resolve, which gave her extra attacks for every wound she'd sustained. So it just made her more deadly the more hurt she was. I mean, you might see this translated into Total War Warhammer. She also had Rouse to Wrath, which meant that if there was a forest nearby, she could kind of teleport units to that forest. The idea is she's waking up those tree spirits in that bit of the forest if there was one on the table. This could be a kind of summoning for her in Total War Warhammer, perhaps we might see. And her other one is the Blessed of the Ancients, which gave her more leadership if she was near forests or woods. So that's what that rule did. So that's how she played on the tabletop. We are going to be getting her in the latest update for Total War Warhammer 2. If you already own Realm of the Wood Elves DLC for Total War Warhammer 1, I believe. But can't wait to get our hands on her. She's a bit more of an iconic character than there is necessarily lore written about her. There's also an additional story that I didn't include in this tale, where she fights Calaud de Garamond, which is a character in the Grail Knight book, in the Questing Knight book, and it basically kind of follows one character as he goes through the ranks of Bretonnian Knight in the Warhammer world. Now, the reason I didn't include this is I couldn't figure out a way where to include it in the timeline for it to make any kind of sense going forward, and I think it might be one of those pits of Games Workshop lore that just clashes too much with other lore, and so kind of stops making sense a little bit. But it would basically involve Drycha and Coedil, having set him free, trying to stop Orion again from being born in the Oak of Ages. And that's where the conflict happened, and the knight fought her and managed to defeat her and see through her illusions that she managed to cast. But I just couldn't make it fit, guys, so I hope you'll forgive me for that in terms of telling a story. It does give some good descriptions, which I did incorporate into some of this lore, so I hope you guys enjoyed some of that. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this video, and hope to catch you all on the next one. Alright, guys? Bye.